Well, welcome to our 9th episode of Ideas and Lives. And we're really thrilled today to have Tom Bewick, a good friend, and he'll be our youngest guest on the program.
Wow.
And Zvi Bodie is a financial economist, my co-host on this Ideas and Lives YouTube channel and podcast.
I guess I'm the oldest person who's been.
Yeah, you're older than me, but Dave, I think, might beat you.
Oh,
one
that's
of our interviewees, I think, would beat you. But Tom Bewick, I've known Tom for I don't know what, 7 years maybe. Tom came to the United States and we bonded immediately, and we've run several transatlantic forums on apprenticeship over the years. And unfortunately, with COVID, we haven't had the chance to meet live as much as we were doing. But Tom is an extremely interesting fellow. He is CEO of the Federation of Awarding Bodies in the UK, and we'll get into that.
He's going to have to explain what that is,
and he'll explain what that is.
And
I'll explain some other things for some of our American watchers and listeners about the UK system of O levels and GSCEs and all these levels. But we are really interested in, as the label says, the arc of Tom's life and career and his ideas moving forward and how they've evolved. So, Tom, welcome.
Thanks, Bob. It's great to see you, albeit two-dimensional, and of course to meet Zvi as well for the first time via Zoom. And look, you know, what I miss probably more than anything about not seeing you, Bob, is these long car journeys that we've been on in often various parts of the world, you know, whether it's on the road from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, we've had some great chats, or whether we've been up to Shakespeare's birthplace here in England, and we've talked about all sorts of things from apprenticeships to anti-Semitism, and Jeremy Corbyn, I think, was one conversation we had, or indeed the many times, and I miss it dearly, that I've been in the United States with you, with your colleagues, with friends at the Department of Labor and across the US, talking about skills and apprenticeships. So it's just fantastic to be able to meet you both and talk to you about ideas and lives. I hope I can come up with something even half interesting as your life, Bob, for sure.
Oh, no, your life is extremely interesting.
Well, you two guys know each other too well. You're going to have to,
yes.
I think
you're going to have to introduce
to,
me
ask
to
them as real questions.
This is my opportunity to learn about the world of let's call it vocational education and apprenticeship.
Yeah. So, Tom, let's talk about how you got started, your early education. You know, you had a little tough going there with, losing a parent and not having the easiest time growing up, but maybe there were some positives coming out of it.
Yeah, I mean, I had quite an adverse childhood, like so many people around the world, but I obviously took a lot from it. And growing up, I was born, by the way, in if you had a map of Britain and you put a pin in the middle of England, that's very close to where I was born and grew up, in a place called Coventry. It's probably famous for two things, really. I mean, it's the equivalent of the Detroit of the motor industry, even today, actually, here in the UK. It makes the famous Jaguar motor cars, has done over many decades. Initially, actually, it was the center of bicycle manufacture just after the first industrial revolution. And then obviously when the petrol combustion engine came along, they upgraded to cars. And not surprisingly, it's a place now that's the center of new battery technology for motor vehicles as well. So I'm quite proud in that sense, where I was born in the English Midlands. It's also kind of very famous as well for being one of the most bombed cities during the Second World War, which is why it's not particularly a pretty city to visit these days, because the Luftwaffe managed to completely flatten it during World War II. So it's, alas, sort of a city that's in the throes of modernism, but at the same time still got a lot of that sort of post-war brutalist architecture. But my mother, died of a heart attack. I was quite a young age. I was in the care of my father for a couple of years. Let's just say, he had rather too fond a relationship with gambling and with the booze, which kind of made him a not very attendant father. And it was only a matter of time, really, before I found myself in local authority care and being brought up by foster parents. Had lots of.
What was your father's occupation? Did he have an occupation?
Well, we have this very peculiar thing in this country. It's called the Register General's Scale, and it's actually a classification of class that sociologists use. So we have and it's a classification of 1 to 5. So when you look at my birth certificate, actually, it says father's occupation. It actually has the words refuse attendant. In other words, my father had probably one of the sort of, lowest paid, lowest skilled jobs. But then next to it actually says Register General 5, a classification 5, which means in terms of this social class scale, my father was at the bottom of the scale. And what's interesting now, when I look at my own children's birth certificates, is, of course,
they still do.
I'm a
this
CEO.
now?
I've been a director of companies for most of my adult life, and it says Register General's classification 1. So, from a British sociological social mobility story, in one generation, I've gone from being classified as 5 to 1 in terms of the classification scale that sociologists use in this country to measure intergenerational social mobility, which is probably one of the reasons why that's an area I'm so passionate about and got some quite strong views about, which is something I'd like to talk to you about.
That's very interesting. I mean, the English have always been, at least in the last few hundred years, very class conscious. And I didn't realize they had a numerical scale.
Yeah, we have this numerical scale. It as I say, it is used as an official measure of social mobility. We have a formal commission, actually, the British government has, called the Social Mobility Commission, and they use that registrar classification, a sort of taxonomy of social class, but they also are using other survey data, household data, census data as well.
Still existing?
It still exists. It's still
on your
used.
Children's birth certificate, it will say a 4 or a 5 or something.
Yeah, you can. Yeah, so when I had to put down my occupation, just like you have standard industry classification codes, we also have, obviously, occupations are mapped against the Register General's classification in terms of social class, and anything company director or CEO would be mapped across to number 1. Yeah.
So on these dating websites, the matchmaking, is that something that everybody pays attention to?
Well,
looking for a number 1.
Yeah, sweet. I know you announced me, as Bob did, as your youngest interviewee so far, but I'm afraid the dating apps rather passed me by. I'm a 50-year-old, so I was fortunate, depending on how you look at it, to have been more in the good old-fashioned dating, where you actually had to go out to places and meet people if you wanted to date. So yeah, there was no swiping left or right or any of these online dating sites. Well, I'm sure these sorts of classifications will be used by the dating agencies, but I think, on a serious point, both of you, I mean, why I think it's, and you actually alluded to this, Svi, about Britain's almost immovable class system, which of course goes, in many ways actually back to the Norman conquest. And I don't want to go down too much of a rabbit hole, but if you think about this great date in British history and English history in particular, 1066, it was a conquest not just of warring European nobilities, one on the French side of the Channel in Normandy and the remnants of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms here in Britain, but actually was for 300 years a takeover of language and culture. You know, the language of the nobility, the language of the hierarchy, the language of the elites was Norman French for 300 years. So the class system in many ways falls out of obviously a feudal system of landowners and peasantry, but it also, why I think it particularly affects Britain, and it's very hard to shake off, is because ultimately it's also grounded in a conquest where, whether it's north and south of the country, or the landowners versus the non-landowners, that class system has never really gone away. Now, since the Second World War, obviously, there's been great progress and great efforts, particularly in the field of education, to introduce more of a meritocracy in Britain. And of course, you have seen more what you might call, traditionally working class people from that, scale 5, numerical 5, have become socially mobilized, they've professionalized, they've got jobs in government. But we have, the way I look at it is we've kind of replaced a very crude social class system, which was governed very much by even your accent, your dialect, where you lived in the country, your relationship to land ownership. I think on the whole, that kind of crude social class system has been replaced by more of a meritocracy. But that meritocracy itself has not really resulted in rapid intergenerational social mobility on the scale that it has in the United States, where there is still this remnants, this ideal, isn't there, of the American dream, that you can be, from very, very poor surroundings and get to the very top of companies, the very top of public places.
In America, everyone is middle class.
Yeah,
but
yeah,
there are disputes about how mobile we really are. But I'd like to come back to you, Tom, and we'll relate it to what you just talked about. And that is getting into your college period, and the fact that one other element of the class system and leadership system in the UK is an education at Oxford or Cambridge. Seems to be a very high correlation between that and, say, people in the Parliament and in other areas. I don't know whether that's still true.
no.
How did that affect you that you were not? What did you do, and how did it affect you that you were not a part of the Oxbridge system?
Well, it's quite a bit to unpack there, Bob, but let's, and in some ways I was alluding to it when I talked about, there has been a breakdown of a crude social class system in Britain, but I do think it has been replaced by what, some writers and commentators have called almost the Brahmin Oxbridge caste system. So if you think about India, which has a very rigid caste system, what we've got when you particularly look at access to top jobs in Britain, to what some might call elitist occupations in the judiciary, in the military, members of parliament. And I would encourage actually your watchers, if they want to sort of really look into the detail around this, to actually Google a report called Elitist Britain, which was actually commissioned by the government. It was commissioned by the Social Mobility Commission, but it was undertaken by a think tank called the Sutton Trust. This is a particular non-profit that looks at social mobility, and it was published in 2019. So it's a relatively up-to-date report. I've actually just got a couple of stats for you both, because I think they're a very instructive way into this debate to really sort of understand just how, in some ways, little progress we're making for equality of opportunity here in Britain. So if you imagine 7% of the population are privately educated, and of that 7% that are privately educated, roughly 1% of the population are graduates of Oxford and Cambridge. But in terms of what that track of students, if you like, represents in British public life, 29% of members of Parliament privately educated. It goes up to 57% in the House of Lords. And actually, there's been an 8% increase in the number of privately educated members of the House of Lords just since 2014.
So, Tom, when you say privately educated, I mean, here in the US, we have this image of kindergarten to 12.
So I'm talking about
schools.
So I'm talking.
Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, I'm talking about just the phase of what you might call compulsory education. 7% of the population are educated in private school. By the way, I don't have a problem with independent schools. I've always taken quite a libertarian view that parents ultimately should have the right to educate their children in whatever way they see fit. I don't believe in a holistic 100% state education system. But what I do have a real problem with is this link, this very unhealthy link between the fact that we've got a very small proportion of the population that are privately educated in the compulsory system. The fact that graduates of Oxford and Cambridge only account for 1% of the population, yet they appear, as I say, 40% of the British cabinet is from just those two universities. 44% of our national newspaper columnists. These are important people because they shape a national conversation. 59% of civil service permanent secretaries. So, okay, we have a different system of government, as you know, as a parliamentary democracy. We have a number of ministers, and then we have a permanent civil service. We don't have this huge changeover of personnel that you have in the federal United States system when you have a change of president with an executive that's appointed in all the top tier positions by the president. So we have this thing called the permanent civil service. And the highest position, unelected position, is a permanent secretary of, say, the Department for Education or the Department of Health or the Home Affairs, Foreign Affairs Department. Nearly 60% of those permanent secretaries went to Oxbridge. So you start to see how 1% of the educated population is accounting for 60% of the permanent government of the country. So it's a very, very small. It's very, very level. Small gene pool. And by the way, Bob, as you know, I failed my qualifications at school in the compulsory phase, and via working in a supermarket, I came back to night school. But even I'm considered to have gone to an elite university. I went to the University of Bath. It's in the top 5 universities in the country after Oxford, Cambridge, University College London, the London School of Economics, and then the University of Bath is next. And so, even I would be considered to have gone to an elitist university when you look at the graduation routes.
Well, at least in a prior generation in the United States, City College and Brooklyn College in New York City were responsible for an inordinate amount, at least of intellectuals, of scientists. I think Kenneth Arrow.
Sure,
and a whole number of them.
Yeah, and again, look, when you look at the top 10 universities in the world according to the global rankings, 5 of them are from the United States. Obviously, they include MIT, Harvard, Stanford University, University of California, and they include 4 British universities: Oxford, Cambridge, I think it's University College London, and Imperial College London. And there's only one university globally in the top 10 that's not either from the United States or from the UK, and that's the Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich in Switzerland. So, I'm always very careful not to be seen to be knocking these universities, these ancient universities. I think there is a place in society for these world-class universities, particularly where they're engaged in world-class teaching, world-class research. Obviously, we have an open society, so we want the best academics from around the world. Look at the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, was pioneered by those scientists at Oxford University. So, I don't take, if you like, there was that big debate, wasn't there, in France with President Macron has been talking about closing down the École Nationale Administration because there's again, France has a very similar challenge where when you look at the governance of the country and you look at where the talent has been drawn from, it's a very, very small gene pool. But I don't think the answer is to, abolish Oxford or Cambridge. Likewise, I don't think the answer is to abolish private education. I think what we've got to try and do is, given that government is the employer, right? Government has decided to employ permanent secretaries of government departments, and 60% of them come from a very, very small gene pool in terms of their educational experience. So I think it's within government's gift when it recruits to diversify the talent pool that it's drawing those, the talent and expertise from. Is how I feel.
But
you
Tom,
talk about the higher education, but you're saying it's also at the level of compulsory, in other words, K through 12, I assume.
So K through 12, we have 93% of the population under the age of 18 is educated by the state. They're in publicly funded institutions, and obviously there's a debate about how good those institutions are, and depending on where you live, and we have different types of schools. There's quite a bit of diversity in terms of publicly funded schools. But then we also have 7% of the population where parents have decided themselves. To be fair to those parents, by the way, it's why I'm not really anti-private school, I'm not anti-independent school, because after all, they've paid their taxes once, they've decided to, in effect, pay twice to pay for their offspring to go to these, what are very confusingly, I know to an American audience, sometimes they're called public schools, and of course they're not public in the sense of publicly funded at all. They're privately funded. That's why I'm using, just to be clear on this call, using the language of these, the 7% of the population are privately educated. But when you see that 7% then disproportionately then represented in the military top positions, in the judiciary, where 70% of judges have come from that 7% privately educated pool. It's a great marketing signal, isn't it, to the parents that have paid for, because they know, they know what they're buying, right? They know that if they buy a privileged education, a privileged institution, they're going to set their offspring up for a very privileged life.
But what's the mechanism? For example, one possible mechanism is that the private schools simply do a much better job of helping people learn how to learn and do very well through their higher education experiences and through their initial jobs. Or is it something more nefarious?
Well, I think it's more nefarious, but I think it's back to Svi's point about the British class system again. These independent schools, some of them have a heritage going back to the 13th and even 12th centuries. So if you think about two of the last four British prime ministers, so start with Gordon Brown, then we had David Cameron, then we had Theresa May, and now we've got Boris Johnson. David Cameron and Boris Johnson both went to the same independent school at Eton at about the same time. Now, Eton dates from the reign of King Richard II. We're looking at the time of the Peasants' Revolt, the sort of 1380s in England. And when you go to those kind of institutions, they're fine institutions and they have this great history behind them. But they're in no doubt that what they've always been about from the time that they were established was to train the leaders of tomorrow, to train.
Are they still boarding schools?
Yeah, because they're very successful at obviously selling those places to overseas pupils. Right. And that's why you've had, the ironies about Britain, it's probably, in terms of its independent school sector, including Oxbridge, it's probably disproportionately as well produced more dictators than any other country. You think about the likes of Idi Amin, for example, in Uganda, King Jong-un, of course, famously went to school in Switzerland, not in
So,
England.
so Tom, you managed to overcome this, and I want to ask about you, how you did it, and also one area that maybe these schools and these elite areas are not as strong in is in business entrepreneurship, perhaps, I don't know, maybe finance. And so I want you to fold in that question on the issue of whether there is a tendency to look down on people who are business entrepreneurs, which I believe was the case, at least in some periods of your history.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably less so these days, but it's back to this, a system that's underpinned by academic snobbery. So it's not just the fact that we've got a system that often looks down on people who work in business or entrepreneurs. It has a particular, unlike, I've experienced in the US, for example, where you can meet entrepreneurs who will celebrate their business failures as much as their business successes. Here, there's still a stigma attached to business failure, even if you've gone on to succeed. So there's a different sort of cultural dynamic. But, I think the British commentator and sociologist David Goodhart summed this up very well in his most recent book called Head, Hand and Heart, where he looks at the whole issue of the massive increase in university participation. 50% of under 30-year-olds now go to university in Britain. But the way he kind of describes it is we just haven't valued those people who make their living using their hands in the caring professions, using their hearts, and we've kind of become obsessed with what he calls the cognitive class. This kind of, in a sense, this is a move on from the Registrar General's scale of class, very rigid structures I was talking about at the start of this interview. And, he's dividing the world into this notion of we're valuing the skills and aptitudes of people who use their brains to earn a living, the knowledge workers. And what we're neglecting is what I've called the know-how workers, in my writing in the past. Yeah. So in other words, we've privileged the knowledge economy instead of the know-how economy, when in fact, actually, that's a false choice. We need to value people and occupations that come together to create a civilized society that delivers the important skill around know-how and application of knowledge, and also abstract knowledge, which in my view is good in itself. We don't have to have a kind of a false argument, a utilitarian argument that the only purpose of university is to produce people for the labor market. We have politicians now standing up and saying, we've got to reform our universities because they're not delivering people who have employability skills. Well, obviously, in a mass higher education system, you don't want tens of thousands of graduates coming out that are completely unemployable. But equally, I do want, coming back to the Oxbridge discussion, I do want a young person who's absolutely fascinated with the period of the Plantagenet British history, or the Anglo-Saxons, or medieval art, or the Renaissance period. I want them to feel they can go to a top university and just study that for its own sake, because we need those people in our society as well. So, we've reached a point, I think. It's what David Goodhart calls peak head. We've kind of reached this tipping point now, I think, in public policy discourse and in educational policy discourse, where we're looking at a rebalancing of policy, a rebalancing of investment, and a rebalancing of attention, I think, away from just an obsession of mass higher education, and saying, why aren't we valuing more the skills of those people that want to pursue other routes other than just via university? So, Tom,
we're moving along.
Sorry, if I'm talking too much, Bob,
No,
just
no.
tell me to shut up.
It's wonderful. It's wonderful, but I did want to get into some other topics.
Sure.
The two that, well, the three that come to mind are you're starting your work in the Blair administration, your elected role in Brighton Hove, and your involvement in the Brexit movement. So
Yeah.
let's take those in turn.
That's quite a long arc of history. That's about 20, that's about 20 years, I think. Yeah.
And I still don't. I don't want to let this other one go without sort of completing the picture of how does one get vocational education in the UK today?
So, yeah, today it's via the apprenticeship route, and you know, Bob and I have had many conversations over the years. He's studied the English system. He probably knows as much about it as I do from an academic point of view about the journey in England in terms of the expansion of apprenticeships. But it is you have a very kind of well-trodden path for 50% of the population, which is coming out of key stage or year 12, getting A levels, advanced levels here in England, and then that's the passport to university. The other 50% have a myriad of opportunities. Apprenticeship is one of them. Going straight into a job without any further training is obviously another option, although very few 16 to 24-year-olds manage that these days. The youth aspect of, I think, Western labour markets has changed massively. Most people are joining the labour market in a serious way in their early 20s these days, which is very in stark contrast to Switzerland, for example, where 2/3 of under 24-year-olds are doing the apprenticeship. They're doing the learning and earning route. But Bob, coming back to your kind of 20-year arc of history in terms of my personal biography, I mean, so at the age of 24, I remember sitting in in number 10 Downing Street in one of the many conference rooms, state rooms they have there, with Tony Blair at the head of the table, and Alistair Campbell, his famous spin doctor, not very far away from him. But I was there because I was supporting the education secretary, a man called David Blunkett. And this was shortly after the famous landslide victory in 1997. And of course, as a 24-year-old, I had to look back at the last 10 years of my life then and really pinch myself, because 10 years previous to that, I was in foster care in a post-industrial English town, one that had been very affected by the Thatcherite reforms of the 1980s. Coal mines had closed down in my local community. A lot of these car factories, not least because they'd been state subsidized during the 1970s, were also closed down. A lot of manufacturing was going off to then the emerging China. So, the economic context of the world in which I grew up in was quite harsh, not just for me as an individual, but actually for a lot of people who were grown up in my community as part of that sort of Thatcher revolution, that sort of rebalancing of the British economy away from its traditional industries and manufacturing towards starting that journey towards more of a service-based economy. By the way, in the long arc of history now, I'm less anti-Thatcher that I think now than I was then, because I realised that for all the bad things that she did, and there are many things that I still disagree with, actually taking a role in beginning to restructure the British economy, it was going to happen sooner or later, and China was going to rise sooner or later. And frankly, given that we've actually cut our global emissions by 40% since the mid-1990s, we clearly managed to export a lot of pollution alongside that as well. So, our kids are growing up in cleaner air. So I'm not one of these sort of romantic lefties that looks back to the era of the coal mines and says, we've got to bring them back, because that wasn't great for people's health either. So, I come back to this 24-year-old in Downing Street, you know, with a newly elected prime minister, looking back 10 years at where I was, then the fact that, you know, I didn't obviously do very well in that K to 12 education system. I left with just one O level. It wasn't O level in English, so clearly I learned to read and write. I think that was an important skill.
Now, what is O level? That's
One
achieving mastery.
Yeah, you know, achieving the sort of the standard that's expected. It's a kind of, you know, pass in terms of your high school diploma. I should have really left with at least 6 O levels, but I only left with one O level in English, which again is ironic because, of course, I represent today the examination boards that are responsible for that system. So, you know, I did get off to a great start. But I did have this great experience. I do want to mention this just very briefly because I think it's, you know, it's when I fell in love with North America, Bob. I mean, I you know, as a 17-year-old with only one O level, working at the supermarket, I did then spend a year working, but then also going to night school 4 nights a week, where I did another equivalent of 4 O levels. It then changed to these new GCSEs, which is the equivalent of O levels, the General Certificate in Secondary Education. That's what it stands for. So, you know, I did get a clutch of those qualifications, and I also did 2 A levels as well, in sociology and in English. So A level stands for advanced level. So by the time I turned 18, actually I was looking around thinking, you know, I'm in a town just north of Coventry. I didn't particularly, you know, I could see the peer group that I was friends with. They were, you know, going off and frankly getting up to no good sometimes. And I really wanted to get out of the place where I'd grown up. So I applied to a voluntary scheme in Canada. In fact, a great guy, a Methodist preacher actually called Charles Cato, who'd set up a charity, a non-profit based in Toronto called the Frontiers Foundation. And the Frontiers Foundation is still going today, as part of his legacy, even though he's moved on. You know, it was a charity, a non-profit that essentially worked in what we would now call Indigenous First Peoples reservations. So I was dispatched out to Northern Alberta to work on a community project. And really that was the big sort of awakening for me, because I realized that actually, I mean, look, you know, I have this phrase now about my educational failure, and Svi might like this one, and that is, you know, I say that schooling killed off my desire to learn, you know, the process of schooling, you know, what Ivan Illich famously referred to as deschooling society, right? So I make a distinction between schooling, and then I go on to say, but education transformed my life, right? So it's why I'm so passionate about education, because I value what education can do for societies. And indeed, I absolutely, you know, agree with what H.G. Wells, the, you know, author of War of the Worlds, famously said. He was also a Labour candidate, by the way, a Labour Party candidate during the 1945 general election in Britain. But H.G. Wells said that, you know, civilization was a race between education and catastrophe, right? So, you know, for me, I really, really value the importance of education, and education for its own sake, not just, you know, education for the world of work, although that's really important as well in terms of good technical and vocational education. So back to the 24-year-old, you know, I had to pinch myself when I was sitting there in number 10 Downing Street, you know, with a newly elected prime minister, thinking about that journey, not just the personal journey for me, but also for the country, because the whole reason why Tony Blair was elected and why he won a landslide was because, you know, New Labour was a project that was about trying to reconcile aspects of the Thatcherite revolution, you know, the acceptance of, in large swathes of
market forces,
the market forces, the use of sort of quasi-markets in the public services. But it was also this sort of concept of social justice, where actually, you know, challenging the kind of previous conservative doctrine, where they seem to be more than happy to sort of spend and borrow money on the bills of what we called economic and social failure, when actually what the Blairite agenda was about was to say, well, these are two sides of the same coin, right? We need a dynamic market economy. We need business people, entrepreneurs. We need people paying their taxes, because ultimately it's those taxes that pay for the public goods and for the public services that we want to see. And that was the sweet spot. I mean, I call that now, actually, I think that's the radical center of British politics. It's why I would describe myself these days, I'm not, I don't consider myself, I never have actually, a sort of a socialist. I consider, myself a radical centrist, I'm in that sort of tradition, and not liberal either, because I think that's a different kind of centrism. But it is an acceptance that, the market has a place in society, as indeed does the state. There is such, because Margaret Thatcher famously said, didn't she, in the 1980s, there's no such thing as society, there's only individuals and their families. And so those of us who were on the centre left of politics kind of rejected that notion, and instead, grounded our political philosophy and ideology more in this, I guess, the great American writer, Etzioni, who writes about responsive communitarianism. I've always sort of been very sympathetic to that more communitarian sort of view of society and politics. You see it in Israel with kibbutzism, for example, which is kind of, it's got a...
Yeah, although the kibbutz is...
yeah, but I'm not, but I'm not fond.
We worked on a kibbutz, by the way.
Yeah, great. But but I suppose the point is it's not market, it's not state, and there's something to be found, I think, in the values of communitarianism, not of the authoritarian sort of strand, but of, I think, this sort of notion of mutual, mutualization, mutual institutions,
and in the US,
have a place
term,
to play.
Mediating institutions or intermediating
civil society,
institutions, churches, civil society, and so on. We could go on and on this issue,
sure.
but I do want you to give some of our viewers who are not well versed in the way Brexit evolved and how an intelligent person like you, not anti-immigrant or anything like that, could favor it, because some writers here kind of link Brexit to the election of Donald Trump. And so tell us about how you came to view Brexit, what your involvement in it was, and also how you campaigned. When you campaigned, what did you experience from people's views? So first your view, and then.
But Bob, I mean, I think you gave it away slightly when you said, "Oh, Tom, how could you have voted for Brexit?" I mean, I know that's still the kind of standard New York Times sort of shock horror. Who are these British people that voted to leave this supranational construct called the European Union? And do you know what? Even to this day, I still feel that people on both sides of the Atlantic and certainly, our ruling elites here still don't really get what Brexit was about. And I'll explain shortly in terms of what I mean by that, because, at one level, people look at it as just an argument between, a group of kind of, the ruling elite that were very happy to be part of this European sort of super club set up after the end of the Second World War. Britain was a relative late joiner, of course, famously rejected by Charles de Gaulle twice before eventually joining in the mid-1970s. And somehow this kind of community of sort of left behind, aggrieved people, the kind of base that Donald Trump was trying to appeal to, during the 2016 presidential election. Indeed, I was there with you and Ariella in your fine house
when we were surprised
in DC when we watched the result. But I don't think the two I mean, as seismic as those two political events are, they're not at all directly comparable. And let me tell you why. And it comes back to my love of British history, and in particular, English radical history. And, anyone that's studied, the social history of England from about the period of, Magna Carta 1215 onwards to the Levellers. This was a sort of late Middle Age movement that was challenging the aristocracy, that was challenging the land enclosures. And this results around about this, the 16th and 17th centuries into these social movements in England that, result actually in our own civil war. We had it some hundreds of years before our own civil war. And effectively it was over the issue of, where sovereignty in our polity, where it lay. Did sovereignty lie in the hands of the king, of a monarch and his immediate nobility, or actually the concept of sovereignty, does that actually rest, albeit arguably still in an abstract way, but it rests in the hands and in the lives of the people. And indeed, there's this fascinating parliamentary debate, in 1642, just during the period of the English Civil War, where Parliament, having decided that it's going to go to war with the king, it's going to assert its parliamentary authority over the king's tyrannical nature, passed an ordinance that made it very clear that the sovereignty of the land rests in the common good of the people. And that is still the doctrine now that drives the notion of it's the House of Commons in our parliamentary system that is the supreme lawmaking body of the land. So when you begin to understand, the construct of our governance through the lens of our own social history, now, of course, we were still hundreds of years away at that point during the English Civil War from popular national sovereignty. The notion of one person, one vote, and everybody getting the vote. Women didn't get the vote in this country until 1928. Working class people, i.e. the non-propertied, non-landowning people, didn't get the vote until 1842, and then again in the 1870s, when there was, if you like, universal manhood franchise in Britain. Women, many women were still excluded from the vote until 1928. But why I talk about this story and why it's really important for Brexit is because the whole issue about the relationship between a parliamentary government, parliamentary sovereignty, as I've explained, and a supranational entity called the European Union that over many decades has in effect undermined that 1642 ordinance of the House of Commons being, the supreme legislative chamber for the country, elected by us, the people. Therefore, they are exercising the power that we give to them every 5 years on our behalf. And then at the time of the general election and the parliament is dissolved, in our constitution, in effect, it's an unwritten constitution, but it's there in the ordinances, sovereignty returns back to the people, and then the people decide who they want to be their representatives in the parliamentary government. So the whole point about Brexit is this irreconcilable notion of accountable government and unaccountable elites and unaccountable government.
So but
Brussels
let's say evolution wise, I mean, what happened was people really thought of it as first a trade. It's kind of what we used to call thin entering wedge, that you start from a narrow and you go into the broad. You started out as, a trade situation. Let's trade with Europe.
It starts out, of course, for the
what's wrong with that?
Oh, there's nothing wrong with that, but then it evolved way past that.
Right.
Yeah, I
Right.
mean, yeah. So I mean, it starts off. I mean, actually, and I mean, as you know, Bob, I've got a master's degree in European public policy, and I think that was the other thing that shocked a lot of people. You know, how could this very well-educated person who's actually, you know, done a Erasmus master's program, you know, studied at the University of Copenhagen, studied at the University of Ljubljana in Slovenia, you know, could hold these very trenchant views. But it was to do with the fact that, you know, working class history in this country has always been about that those who make the laws of the land, we need to be able to get rid of them. I mean, that has been the whole kind of, you know, working class struggle for parliamentary democracy in Britain. So, which is interesting because actually, when you look at the Labour Party in the 1970s, the Labour Party, its official policy was to actually be against the European Economic Community. You know, the Labour government led by Harold Wilson was against joining the EEC. And in fact, when they won the election in 1974, that's what triggered then a referendum. We technically already joined, but then the Labour government, because, you know, the Labour cabinet was divided on joining the European Economic Community, then went to the country because that's the other thing a lot of people don't realise. You know, the Brexit referendum in 2016 was actually the second referendum we'd had on the question of Europe. But the 1975 referendum, and I was only 4 years old at the time, so you can imagine I didn't participate in that particular democratic plebiscite. And, you know, Svi, I think you've touched on it in terms of the trading clubs. So there were those, you know, and again, you've got to look at it in the context of where Britain was at the time in terms of its economy. You know, we were literally at that point just a couple of years off from a International Monetary Fund loan. You know, the country was virtually bankrupt. There was a lot of industrial strife. So for the proponents of the EEC, the European Economic Community, the common market, it was sold to the British people in that 1975 referendum as this will make you richer. This will make the country richer. There'll be more jobs. There'll be more trade opportunities. And of course, you know, who would disagree with that? And actually, I mean, I make the joke about it being 4 years old in 1975. I think if I had been 44 years old in 1975, I think I would have voted to join.
Everybody was in favor
European
of that.
Economic Community, yeah. But then it evolved because, of course, the European Union, which of course doesn't become, you know, the construct of the European Union technically until the Lisbon Treaty. It's really the Lisbon Treaty that gives it this new construct of the European Union and this idea of it's called the acquis, which is the supranational body of law that's then overseen by the European Court of Justice. So, Bob, you notice when I've had conversations with you and our American friends, I think you're the ones I met at the Urban Institute when I did a little seminar on this, and, you know, was challenged, I think, you know, by a lot of those liberal people in the room. Well, you know, why would you vote for Brexit? You know, why would you campaign for Brexit? You know, the proposition I put back to you is, let's imagine in the 1970s, a president of yours had you know, done a deal with Canada, you know, a bit like the NAFTA deal with Canada, with Mexico, and with a bunch of other South American countries. But then fast forward to the millennium, the turn of the millennium, and that president was saying to you, well, I know you want to take some of these social issues and economic issues and consumer issues to the US Supreme Court, but I'm sorry, but there's now a court that sits over the US Supreme Court that can put legally binding rulings on the federal government, on state level governments. And that's what happened, you know, with the European.
Well, it wasn't just Justice. The court, right? It was the European Parliament as well.
Well, what the European Parliament was able to do was essentially pass laws that essentially rubber stamped the directives from the European Commission, which is the executive arm of the European Union. So actually, I mean, again, it's a misnomer. And I've heard, you know, some quite educated people often talk about, oh, well, yeah, but you've got the European Parliament. That's a democratic institution. No, it's not, because the European Parliament does not have the power to initiate legislation. The Congress has the power to not only initiate new legislation, but it can also repeal legislation. Now, the president in your system of separation of powers with the executive branch, the judicial branch and the legislative branch, ultimately, obviously, the president could veto legislation that's coming from the legislative branch. But in the European Union construct, it's the unelected commission that actually initiates the legislation. They get a sort of rubber stamp from the Council of Ministers, which is made up of the democratically elected leaders of the members, but all the initiation comes from the Commission. The Commission then puts that legislation to the European Parliament, and it's a straightforward take it or leave it piece of legislation. It's not, you can amend the legislation, you can repeal other legislation, you could have a system of one regulation in and then one regulation out. It's a one-way street, right? And in that sense, it has more in common, in my view, as someone that's studied the European institutions. I've worked in Brussels for a short while as well after I graduated, so I saw the system up close in Brussels. I think it has more in common with the old Soviet Union and actually today's China. You could look at these annual meetings and congresses, and tens of thousands of people are traveling to Beijing to participate in Chinese style democracy or Chinese socialism with democratic characteristics, however they describe their particular systems. So it's back to my 1642 ordinance, and the reason why we had a civil war, right, was the concept that there is no entity other than a constitutional monarch that is there by the consent of the people, right? And that is something that is very unique about, I appreciate to Americans, obviously, fought the British over the abolition of monarchy, right, and tyrannical kings, but still, it's a system that we've evolved over 1,000 years where we accommodate a unelected head of state, but we have the supremacy and the sovereignty is in the House of Commons, right? Is in the hands of ordinary people. That is the supreme legislative.
So Tom, let me ask you. How do you think it's worked out? It's too early to say, probably, but so far, is the issue kind of closed at this point? And
no, because again, Brexit is a process. It's not just the event. It's not the event of the referendum in 2016 or the fact that we only actually formally. it's taken us 5 years to leave this supranational club. It's cost us a whole stack of money. I liken it to it's what we called the Dane Geld, during the Anglo-Saxon wars with the invading Danes in the 9th century. For many years we had to pay them off, and then in the end it came to one almighty battle of we got rid of the kind of the Viking Danish influence over our lives. So Brexit is a process. But look, if there was one book I was going to write, Bob, it would probably be Brexit: The Unfinished Revolution, because whilst, for me, Brexit was about who makes our laws and parliamentary sovereignty. And by the way, it wasn't really about immigration. I know the debate is, look, I know Nigel Farage, right? I got to know him very well. I've had many an argument with him personally about his obsession with migrants and immigration. I've never taken that view. And I'm not going to deny that there weren't sort of, probably racists who were emboldened by the referendum vote who voted for Brexit for solely those reasons. But I don't think you can call 17.4 million people, which is the biggest number of voters that have ever voted for anything. Not even British governments have been voted in with that level of support. I don't think you can call them all racist by any shot. Likewise, the 16 million people that voted to remain in the European Union, I wouldn't accuse any of, I wouldn't say that they all voted just to remain because they're all closet Euro federalists, that want Britain to adopt the euro and want a United States of Europe. I think it's too crude an argument. So it is a process, and given that something like 60% of our laws up until last year were being written in Brussels, it's going to take some time, right, as we adjust to this new reality where all of a sudden we're making laws where we don't have to refer to the European Court of Justice or to the technocrats.
Well, what about
in Brussels? Let me just give you two very very kind of practical examples of actually where Brexit's made a difference already. So the vaccine rollout, right? Until just before the pandemic, Britain was bound by the European Medicines Agency. Obviously, we had our own equivalent of the CDC in England, but for the commissioning and the procurement of and approval of vaccines, that was a competency that was rested at the level of the European Medicines Agency. Well, obviously, we came out of the European Medicines Agency. We've got our own national agency. So when you look at Britain's successful, which is up there with the likes of Israel, for example, in terms of our vaccine rollout program, the reason why that was, why we were as fast as we were with it, we were more agile than our other European neighbours, EU neighbours, was because we weren't arguing over the procurement process between 27 member states. We were only procuring the vaccines from the various suppliers ourselves. We were also able to get round, because we're no longer members of the European Union, their pretty neoliberal state aid rules that's enabled us, for example, to put public investment into those clinical trials in ways that we wouldn't have been able to when we were members of the European Union. So there are very practical ways. We've been able to, for example, abolish value-added tax. This is a goods and sales tax on women's sanitary products. Under the European Union, you had to have a minimum 5% tax on women's sanitary products. We're able now to set up free ports around the United Kingdom. So these are special economic zones in our coastal areas that we were prevented from doing when we were members of the European Union. So
it's parallel in many ways to what we have in the United States between the state governments and their freedom to act versus the national government. And it's quite interesting that the whole issue of how different states dealt with the COVID crisis. Trump took the position that the federal government has no role to play, and it was entirely up to the states.
I wouldn't say that. He did play a big role.
Vaccine.
He did play a big role in
just vaccine.
Spending the money early on to support the vaccine.
Yeah.
Let's close by talking a little more about you, Tom, and now that you're still operating as the CEO of the Federation of Awarding Bodies, and getting back into media that apparently you were involved with as a kid.
Yeah, we need to get the right references so that our viewers can tune in.
Yeah, so
become part of the 60,000.
Yeah, well, look, it's worth just highlighting, Bob, and of course, you'll appreciate this. I'm here very much talking in a personal capacity. It's I'm not here to represent any interest actually, other than myself, and that's why it's just been so enjoyable talking to Svi and yourself this evening. Just get an opportunity just to sound off with my own opinions. But you're right, I do have this very important platform nationally in my day job. I represent the examination boards and the awarding organisations that are responsible for not just public examinations in our state school system, but also responsible for tens of thousands of vocational technical qualifications for apprenticeships. And obviously to do a job like that, you have to be, inverted commas, a politician with a small p, right? Because, you know, who am I representing those members to? I have to deal with ministers in the government, with the skills and apprenticeship minister, with regulators across the UK. So my background in government, you know, my background as an education advisor, working with senior civil servants, working with ministers, obviously comes in handy.
I would imagine that trade unions have a lot to say about that process of licensing, or whatever you call it, when someone passes the exams.
Yeah, I mean, the teacher unions, I mean, it's been really interesting during the pandemic, right? Because we've had to move from a public examination system where everybody has to turn up in a gymnasium hall and write papers, to a system where we've had to change the assessment system, where teachers actually are more front and center in deciding the grades of their students. Now, we've had 2 summers, we've had 2 years where that's been the case. And surprise, surprise, the teacher unions, having been initially, I think, quite a militant group in favor of abolishing public examinations and having, frankly, it pretty much all in the hands of teachers to decide, I think they've had so much grief having to do it. You know, it's pushed a whole new set of responsibilities onto the shoulders of teachers, and also accountability in a way that now, you know, they're dealing with sharp-elbowed, the so-called tiger mums, I think you would call them in the US, that want the best for their particular son or daughter. And, you know, they're going to the teacher, they're going to the head of year saying, what's going on here with my Charles's mathematics grades or geography grades? So actually the teacher unions, I think, are looking forward to getting back to some semblance of normality, where actually these examinations are taken out of the hands of teachers and they're independently marked and they're independently assessed. But that debate about, you know, the secret garden in education, teacher unions wanting to see more of the responsibility in the hands of the teaching profession, and the tension that exists then with politicians and arguably parents as well, who want to see a teaching profession more held to account. And how do you hold them to account? Well, you do it through measures like examinations and assessment. But, you know, we're in an interesting place, I think, post-pandemic, where there is a debate, actually quite an active one now in this country, about whether, you know, there are new forms of assessment that we can look at that don't put so much emphasis on what's called terminal assessment, you know, endpoint examinations, where it comes down to how well you did, your memory recall, to sit a particular paper on a particular day. That does seem to be increasingly quite an antiquated way of trying to test knowledge, skills, behaviours and competence amongst the population.
Well, Tom, this has been fascinating.
It's been quite wide-ranging, isn't it? We've gone
Quite
through.
Yes.
I think we could certainly go on. Maybe we'll have you as another guest.
We'll have you back when you're prime minister.
Right.
Oh, I think, Joe, Svi, I think that ship sailed at the end of my 20s, when I sort of, you know, decided not to go for a safe Labour seat. You know, I sort of decided that, having worked with members of Parliament for many years and saw how much stick they got in the media and by their constituents, it was a kind of job at that point anyway that I was less interested. When I ran for Parliament, you know, 2 years ago as the Brexit Party candidate, I mean, that was a great experience, but I think it brought at that point, it did bring the curtains down on any future sort of pretensions to.
Well, we'll
parliamentary
nominate
career.
you. You know,
For now.
there's a great phrase, if nominated, I will not run. If elected, I will not serve. I don't think you would go that far.
But you know, just to name check, so I'm on GB News now, which is a national news channel. You have the BBC, you have Sky News, and you have this insurgent newcomer called GB News, which has been set up by the veteran political broadcaster Andrew Neil. He's known to some American viewers, not least because he usually has always presented the British electoral election
Yes,
coverage
we've seen him, yeah.
on the BBC, but he no longer works for the BBC. And that's what I'm saying about, in a sense, I've put the political career to one side, obviously got a day job representing a group of interests, but I think it's acknowledgement, of the role I played during Brexit and putting my head above the parapet, the writings that I've done on not just technical vocational education, but on Brexit as well, and the importance of it. That it's a great privilege to be given a national platform in the media to be able to talk about the stories that matter to most ordinary people, and it's great to be able to be part of a TV channel. It's had 1 billion views in the last 10 weeks. It's actually getting audience figures that are better than the BBC News channel now and better than Sky News. Because
how do people get on? How do people get on that channel from the US, let's say?
Well, it's on YouTube, so it's not behind any paywall or any particular cyber virus.
Okay.
So if you just look up GB News on YouTube, you can access it that way. And I'm always on the Monday night show, although I'm going to be swapped to Tuesday next week because we've got a public holiday on Monday. It's our last bank holiday of the year, last public holiday of the year. So I'll be on the show again next Tuesday.
Well, Tom,
we'll have to have that information at our website.
right.
Yeah.
Tom, it's been wonderful, as it always is when we have a chance to chat. And I'm glad that the wisdom that you provide when we talk directly now is going out to our whole podcast and YouTube channel as well.
Yeah.
So
it's great.
Cheerio.
Yeah,
well,
it's great to see you both.
Zvi has the way we finish our programs.
Go on,
What do you say, Zvi?
We say sei gesund,
Which is for
Which means-
non-Yiddish listeners,
which means be well.
right?
Really, goodbye.
Yeah,
So sei gesund.
That's it.
Zvi.
Sei gesund.
Okay.
Right. I shall remember that. And Zvi, I'm looking forward to catching up with you in person when I do eventually make it across.
Oh, yes.
Really
That'd
look
be
forward to
great.
meeting you. And
right.
Bob, thoughts and best wishes to you and everybody at the Lerman household in Washington, D.C.
All right. Thanks.
Take care.
Thanks very much.
Bye.